Hello and welcome to Microsoft Hates Greg. My name is Greg Deckler, and today we're going to be revisiting the and slicer in Power BI. And the reason we're doing that is, well, one, it's one of my favorite little bits of DAX code that I've ever created over the years, along with probably like Cthulhu and the DAX index. And also, I had a requirement come up in the community forums where instead of having like a card visual, they wanted to be able to have a patient cohort or and slicer. In a table visual. So we're going to be going through the changes that it's not a huge number of changes, but some slight changes you need to get this to work in a table visual. I'll explain the difference as to why. But just so we cover everything, and slicer concept comes up more often than you think. But the normal way that a slicer works, it's more like an or slicer. So if I select like 4 different diagnosis codes for a patient, you can see over here that a normal table, I've got 2,495 patients that have had either the T93 diagnosis or a T90 diagnosis or a T83 or a T82. But there's only been 8 patients that have had all 3 diagnoses, and that is the 8 that you see here. They're patient IDs, they're anonymized patient IDs. And this is actually the reason it's called patient cohort is because the actual business scenario that this came up in, where I needed to create this and slicer, was actually it was doctors, and apparently doctors put together cohorts of patients. That's what they call it, and they like to say, okay, if I want a cohort of patients that have these diagnosis codes, but they want all the patients to have all of those diagnosis codes. So you need an and slicer. Okay. So the way that the typical the and slicer works is this measure here called cohort. And I'll zoom in here. So the way that this works, and again, it's not the only way to do an and slicer. It's probably not the most performant way to do an and slicer. And I would ding it as far as it's a little bit obfuscated in terms of how it actually works. In fact, I've had some people that know DAX quite well, but I've had difficulty in explaining why this works exactly. So, and I just, I think it does demonstrate some really kind of interesting concepts around context and things like that. So in a card visual, right, we don't have any filter context within the card visual itself. We only have what's coming from the slicer. So what we do is we generate a distinct list of patients. Okay, that's the first one, to generate distinct. So we have a distinct list of patients. And then we do an except, where we again use distinct of the diagnoses, right? Distinct list of the diagnoses, and then a calculate table distinct diagnoses, which some people may think, well, what in the world is going on with that? You're just using distinct twice of the same column. You just wrapped one in a calculate table. What the heck is going on? Well, the first thing you need to understand is that some people will say that that generate creates a Cartesian product between 2 tables. And that's not technically kind of correct. It really is what's going on is it's evaluating every row in the first table against every evaluated row in the second table. And that's important to remember. Because in certain cases, except in our case, is going to return blank. And so those rows will not be included when the generated table, right? So the patient won't appear if except evaluates to blank. All right, so what's going on here is distinct, since there's no filter context within the card visual, and distinct ignores row context, okay? So then when I grab a distinct of the diagnosis codes, then it's just going to return me those 4 that are selected in the slicer in this case, okay? But when I wrap that same distinct around with a calculate table reintroduces row context. Okay, so now what calculate table in that case is it's in the row context of the patient, right? Because it's being evaluated, for every patient that is, the accept clause is being evaluated. So now that creates a row context for that patient. So what's going to happen when I wrap that with a calculate table is the diagnosis codes that come back are only are the ones for that patient, right? That are also filtered in the slicer visual. So what's going to happen then is that the only case where both of those tables in the accept clause are going to be identical are the patients that have had all 4 diagnoses. All right, so now that's going to evaluate to blank, And so that patient won't be included in the generated table, temp table 1, right? So now what I can do is I can do a temp table 2. I can summarize my temp table 1 by my patient. So I have a distinct list of patients. I could have used distinct again there, but I think I was at the point where it's like, I'm going to have 5 distincts in this thing. I already have 4. But anyway, so then what I can do is I can do an accept of the distinct list of patients against temp table 2. Okay, when temp table 2 is going to include all my patients, right? And so then at that point, that accept, what's going to come out of that accept is, or I'm summarizing temp table 1 by diagnosis. Sorry. But so that's why I'm doing the summarize. So what's going to happen there, I have a distinct list of patients that are in my generated table. I then take a distinct list of all the patients essentially, because again, there's no filter context within the card visual itself. I accept the ones that are in table 2, which leaves me, remember, the patients that meet all those diagnosis codes, that returns blank, and so they're not included in temp table 1. So now, coming out of temp table 3 is my list of patients that have all the diagnosis codes. And then you concatenate X that up, sort it by patient, and you get the result here. Okay, we went a little sideways on the explanation, but we got there. All right, so now what happens is, well, if I include a table of my patients, how can I return the ones that meet the cohort? And so it's really a complex selector, but it's based upon the same AND slicer concept. So in this case, I want to return a 1, so I can use my cohort flag is 1 to filter down to my list of patients. But we need to change our measure a little bit because the patient being in this is different than the card visual, because now I have filter context within every row of this table, right? So how do we get around it? We'll do our old friend all selected. So pretty much anywhere where you saw distinct now becomes all selected. Because now we need to remove the filter context internal to the table visual, the patient ID, and go back to just having, the diagnosis codes from the filter context from the slicer. So what we do is generate, instead of distinct diagnosis patient, all selected diagnosis patient, do an accept all selected diagnosis, calculate table, distinct. We can leave distinct there. We don't need to use all selected in that case. And then we do a summarize against it. We do the same accept with all selected instead of distinct. And we do our max diagnosis patient. So now we grab the patient that is in that table visual, right? And if the patient is in temp table 3, then we return a 1. If not, we return a 0. And you can see the results here. The same patient IDs appear here as in our card visual. So that is how you can convert an AND slicer to work with a table visual, if you will. It's going to vary in everybody else's case, but that's how you do it in this case. So that's all I had for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope the explanation made sense, and I'll see you next time.